Hello and welcome to Salesforce Mojo. I'm Shane Smythe and I'm going to be walking us through Storefront APIs today. Now I'm really excited about this because we've kind of been building up to this point where we've been starting to get into customizing the storefront more and more. And with some of the advancements over the last couple of releases, we've got quite a bit available to us when it comes to customizing without doing a lot of custom code. So we'll talk more about what that means in a second, but these storefront APIs are really going to be important when you're thinking about how do I go outside of the out-of-the-box capabilities and I start to customizing any of the pages inside of Commerce Cloud. So with that, let's jump right in. So when it comes to customizing Salesforce Commerce Cloud, what are your options? How do you actually go about this? Well, today we're going to talk about a couple different approaches and then specifically talk about the best path forward. First, we have our Storefront APIs, and this is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. These are going to be your best options moving forward. However, you also have your Apex controller. This is kind of your standard backend controller you would do across Salesforce. And option one here for using Apex controller is via the Connect API. Now, this is a best practice if you're using your Apex controller because the Connect API respects all of the privileges of your buyer, entitlement policies, price books, etc. So this is going to be the best option for an Apex controller if the Connect API will allow you to do what you need to do. And your last option here is, again, Apex controller, but via normal SOQL type of interactions with Apex or the REST API. And as I mentioned, option one over here for Storefront APIs is going to be the best option if what you need to do is available. So in kind of this order here, you'll start with the Storefront APIs, then you'll move to an Apex controller with a Connect API, and if that doesn't work, then you would move into more of a traditional Apex controller with SOQL or other options in there. Now, I think it's really important that we pause and talk about this for just a moment here. Why is this the best option? Well, it's the best option for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a best practice from Salesforce. Two, it is going to be the most performant solution possible. And three, it's going to be the quickest time to develop as well. It is much easier to go down the Storefront API option than it will be to go down an Apex controller because you start getting into Apex, then you have to do test coverage and you make sure that you have your access set up correctly and you need to actually do that development. With the Storefront API, all of that is kind of hidden behind the scenes and you just have to deal with it on the JavaScript side. Now, continuing down this line of thought here, when you're customizing your storefront, you've got the options we just talked about, but the Storefront APIs is not just a single category. There's actually a couple of different categories inside of it. The first one we're going to talk about in a little bit is the imperative APIs. Then we'll talk about our wire adapters, our Storefront Actions, and as we mentioned, the Apex controller is an option here. But when you're customizing your storefront, there is the front end here, which is your Lightning Web Component. There's the back end, which can either be abstracted out to these APIs, or you can build your own Apex controller. And then, of course, you've got kind of your state management REST APIs if you're going down the Store API route. So as I mentioned, there's three options. There's imperative API, wire adapters, and Storefront Actions. And we're going to dive into each one of these. Now, first up here is our imperative APIs. And I'd say, at least for myself, this is the most common. I use these all the time when we're building our storefronts. They're things like adding items to carts, checking the checkout API, understanding the context API. And essentially what these are is a way that you can use JavaScript without creating your own Apex class to call your storefront data. And typically behind the scenes, this is calling the Connect API to update or return information. Now, as the description mentions here, this is all kind of orchestrated for you. It includes updating some of the wire adapters, and it's orchestrated by that state management that comes with Commerce Cloud. And I've given a couple of those examples of some of these imperative APIs down below, but let's actually hop over into the documentation. So just to give you the lay of the land here, we are inside of the B2B Commerce Developer Guide section of the developer.salesforce.com website, and we are under the Build Custom Components, and there's a Storefront APIs section. And inside of this, there's actually three separate sections or main sections here. There's the imperative, there's the two wire adapters, and then there's the Storefront Actions. So we'll actually go through all of these as we're going through the video today. But on the very top here, you'll actually see the same diagram that I showed earlier, minus kind of the Apex class down below. I find that it's very helpful to read through this section because it does explain a lot of the APIs here and how they're used. You can kind of see each one of the definitions that I pulled from for this video are actually in here as well. So definitely go in here and read it. But in the imperative API section, it'll actually show you all the available imperative APIs at your fingertips. And you can actually go down section by section and understand, you know, the namespace bundling, what actually it is called when you use it, and then a quick description of it, and then the associated endpoints. So if you were to do this, for instance, via the REST API, this is actually what you would use. And I find that they're fairly similar. There's some discrepancies between the API and the imperative API in a couple of situations, but I know the product team is working on closing that. So just make sure you understand what is available in the imperative API in the response versus what is in the endpoint. Now, when I'm thinking about creating a custom component and trying to understand what I'm doing, the first thing I'm going to do is map out my component. You know, what data do I need? What actions do I need to make back to the storefront? And then once I've defined what that is and how I'm going to do it, I will actually come over into the imperative API documentation here and look for the associated Storefront API. So for instance, if we're going to do a add to cart button, which we're actually going to show here in a moment, I'll come in here first and I'll understand, okay, I need to add an item to the cart. How do I actually do that through one of these imperative APIs? And I will go down this list until I find the add to cart in this situation, and we'll be using the add to cart here in our component. And we'll import this through this namespace bundle, which I'll show in a moment, and you'll be able to use this. And now instead of going down the Apex route and either doing the Connect API or doing a sockable into the cart, all this is handled in a single line of JavaScript. Okay, so we're in our VS Code now, and as I mentioned, I have an add to cart component here. And this component will go on the Code It Forward repo here once I have published this video. So you'll be able to go take advantage of this. It's relatively simplified. I did do a little bit of CSS work just to make it look a little bit better than a standard button. But feel free to kind of take this, pull it down, and then modify however you'd like to. But the important parts here are this top section, and then I'll go into this bottom in a moment. But the first thing we have to do is we actually have to import this function here that we're going to use, both the add item to cart and track product to cart. And I'll explain the difference here just in one moment. But the first thing you need to do is import this, and you need to do it from the associated namespace. So if we go back into our documentation here, you can see that the namespace is Commerce Cart API, which is exactly what I have here. And then we have our add item to carts, which is exactly what I have here. And then we have the track add products to cart. And so if we go up into that section of the documentation here, you'll go over into the description. It says triggers the add to cart activity when a shopper adds a product to cart. So that might not be super clear, but what this does is actually helps notify the storefront and the state management that you have actually added an item to the cart. If you don't do this, then the little indicator in the top right of the screen with the cart won't actually change to be the updated value. And when you actually get to the cart as well, you will likely be dealing with a previous version of the cart because the store won't know that the state has been updated behind the scenes, and the state management won't know to go get the information from the database. So it's really important in these situations that you call the right imperative APIs. So in this case, we have a very simple button here, and this button has a little bit of CSS as I mentioned. And then inside of it, we have the add to cart, which we're calling the add to cart that I mentioned before. We're passing in the product ID and we're passing in a quantity. And in this case, as I mentioned, this is a pretty simple example here. I've just hard coded that to 1, so it'll add 1 each time. And when it actually completes the add to cart, it's going to trigger the track add product to cart imperative API, which we'll do as we mentioned here. And then finally, just for a little bit of confirmation that things worked correctly, I put in a event here so that you actually can see that things changed correctly. So now hopping back into our storefront, we can see that we have the add to cart action on the page right now. And if I just hop over into our experience builder here, I'll go to product, and you'll note that this is our add to cart. And as I mentioned, it's pretty straightforward right now. All we're doing is pressing the product ID from one of the expressions on the page, and that is it. So we're logged in as our buyer user now, and you can see that we have the add to cart on the page here. We're currently at a 2 for the cart, and we've got the console up here just so we can show you what is happening behind the scenes. And if you click add to cart right here, it should notify us right here that it's been successful. It's changed it from that 2 to the 3. And you can see that it actually has done an event here where it's responded and said, here are all the values we get back, the messages, the name of the product, the quantity we actually changed to, so we're actually getting that back because of the imperative API that we just called. All right, so next up here we have our Storefront API wire adapters. So wire adapters are a little bit different. They are specifically about getting information from Salesforce and from the store. So in a couple of cases, you could be doing like the cart items adapter that I have mentioned below. You could also be doing this in checkout, so the checkout adapter. But basically, we are trying to get the information from the store. And because this is a wire, anytime that we're loading the page for the first time or any updates happen to that adapter, we're going to get the latest information. So for instance, in checkout, let's say that you've made a change to your address in checkout, or you've made some other change like the delivery method that has been selected, that is going to update the information about your checkout session and some of the adapters behind the scenes, and your adapter in checkout will then get updated. Same thing with the cart items. Let's say we go from 1 quantity on an item to 2. That's going to trigger an update, and we will see that in the actual storefront. So I've made an example of how we can do this in a Lightning Web Component. So let's actually open that up, and we'll see what that looks like actually in the storefront. All right, we're on the storefront now. We're in the cart page, and you can see that everything looks pretty standard so far. Except for this section down here. This is our little simplified cart storefront sample component. So if I open up VS Code, and let's actually navigate over to that component, it is doing a couple of different things. But the first thing we're going to talk about here is the storefront adapter. So you can see we've imported this from the Commerce Cart API. And if we hop over into our documentation, we'll go down to our wire component section, and you can see that we are using this cart items adapter. So that would be this one right here. And we're importing it from our namespace, and we are fetching the cart items, and it looks like it also supports sorting here. So you actually can go through these adapters, and these are really good, as I mentioned kind of in the last segment. If you are trying to customize the storefront, the first place you should go to get information is your adapter. As I mentioned, it's going to be faster from a performance standpoint, and it's going to be faster from a development, and it will make sure that you're abiding by all the rules that Salesforce has around the storefront data here. So go through this adapter list here and make sure that you fully understand what is available and when you actually can use it, because they're pretty comprehensive when it comes to the commerce namespace. And then there's also some on the Experience Cloud namespace that you might want to use from like a CMS perspective. So going back over to our component here, we are actually doing this cart items adapter through a wire right here. And inside of this, we're checking if we're in preview or not. And if we are not in preview, we're just consoling out this data right now. Theoretically, this is where we actually would, have a function or some processing where we take the cart items and then we'd actually, go parse it out and actually put it into items. And if you're looking for a really good example of cart and cart items, in the Code It Forward repository, we have a really good reference component for that Taha from Salesforce made a couple of months back. And I'll put a little call out in the top right here so you can actually go check that out. So if we go back over to our cart page here, we can see that this is the console that we just looked at here. And we can actually see how many items are inside of our cart items. And we can see all the data about this cart item right here, the quantity, the actual ID, the product ID, etc., etc. So all the information is available here. And we did all this without a single line of Apex. So we're going to come back to this component here in just a moment when we get to the next section, but let's actually hop into the next topic we have. So last up on our Storefront APIs, but definitely not least, we have our Storefront Actions. And the Storefront Actions are a little bit different than the last two we mentioned. These are events that we can actually call to the adapters to actually make changes. So we can filter, we can search, we can update items in the cart, we can do a bunch of different things here. And as I've been mentioning, these imperative APIs, or I should say the Storefront APIs, all are going to be more responsive. And you can see it in the description here that these are always going to be UI-based actions, but they're always going to perform faster and better than backend APIs or Apex because of the proximity to where the closest adapter is that can be interfaced with. So there's a couple of examples of this in our Code It Forward repository. I've linked one down below, and I'll also put it up in the little call out in the top right-hand corner. But this is actually going to show you how to use these actions. The actions are a little bit more confusing than some of the other APIs to use, just because the documentation online right now isn't the best. So I'm going to show an example of this here in a moment. And as I mentioned, we have this example in the Code It Forward repo. And on top of that, I will also be writing a blog post about this in a little bit to have just a little bit more of a written out version of this. Let's actually go over into our example. So we're returning to our cart storefront sample here, and inside of the sample, we already talked about this wire adapter section, but we did not talk about the button action that I mentioned before. So to refresh everyone, there's this action that says add more, but we didn't actually click it on the last time around. So before we click it, let's actually look at what it's doing. So we're just doing an on click for this into this function, and this function is calling the request more cart items. And inside of this, I have one stubbed out and one commented out here. And you can see that we are importing in the Commerce Actions API. And again, going back to our documentation here, there's a Store Actions section, and it's going to tell us the categories and all of the actions that are available, and a little description of what it does and what the properties actually are for it. And so you can go and find the one that is applicable to your use case, whether it's cart or checkout or products or search or orders, etc. So you'll find the right ones there. And then what you need to do is import this. However, you can't just use it. You have to actually use the dispatch action async here to actually call it. And that's the part that isn't really written out in a lot of detail right now in the Salesforce documentation. So this is how you'd actually do it. I'm doing an async await here, and we're calling a dispatch action async. We're passing it this, and we're calling whatever action we're doing here. So in this case, we are creating an item update action specifically on this cart item to the quantity of 2. So this is very hard coded, but in theory, in this component here, we have the cart item adapter. We could get the item ID from the adapter, and when the user clicks that item in the table, then we dynamically pass this ID here, and then whatever the quantity is they're trying to change to, we would change that here as well. But this gives you a very verbose written out version of this, so you can understand exactly what needs to happen here. And then above it, I've commented out this one, but there's also a cart clear action, for instance, and this one doesn't have any properties. We're just asking to clear the cart. So this is what that would look like without any properties here. And then as you go back to the documentation, you'll be able to find all the examples and the properties that are needed here. So this dispatch action async, we're going to talk a little bit more about in a couple of moments here. But before we do that, let's hop back over into our storefront here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this, and if it works, it's actually going to move this from 2 to 1. And we should see some updates in the network here as we're doing this. So let's go ahead and click this. We can see that that triggered an action. And you can also see it triggered an update to the wire adapter, which is why we're getting these two consoles here. And if we go over into network, we will see that it loaded the cart item include here as well. And it will have all the information about our cart items in here and all the details about what quantity it is. But you'll notice that if we go back over here to our console, nowhere in this code do we have it actually putting a spinner up or making a change to the actual component over here. We're doing that through the actual action because that's making a change to the data service, and then that service is actually then going in, making an update to the wire, which is then triggering to the standard component over here. And we're seeing all that because we are subscribing to that wire adapter. So I know that's a pretty quick overview of the Storefront Actions, but there's actually one more piece that I promised I'd mention, and that is the dispatch capabilities here. So using dispatch. There's actually two dispatches that at least I'm aware of right now, and that is a dispatch action async. So we just talked about this. This is the one that is going to call one of those actions across any of those pages, so you can interface with the service there. And then we have the dispatch update async, which is slightly different. This update async is specifically for the checkout data provider. And what this allows you to do is actually update any of the information about checkout. So what does that actually look like and do? Let's actually go over into Code It Forward and into an example there, and we will talk through exactly what that looks like. So here we are on the shipping address component, and this is one that I originally did, but about 2 months ago, Craig came in here and made some fantastic updates. So if you have not looked at the shipping address component and are using it on your projects, you absolutely should. If you go down here, it's actually really comprehensive in all the different areas and almost one for one to what is out of the box. But specifically, I want to show the dispatch update async right here, which is what we were just talking about. And you can see that in this section here, this is actually where we're updating the data provider. And we are in this just passing the form request. So that form request is literally just the delivery address in this case. But it actually can be whatever is available in the checkout framework when it comes to the data that you can update there. So the def is one of those objects you can update, but there also are others. And I'm not going to go too far into it in this YouTube right here, but in the blog I mentioned, I'm going to detail out exactly how and what's available there so that you have an example of all the pieces that can be updated throughout the checkout lifecycle. As always, thanks for watching. If you like the video or the content, or you have been watching the series for a while, go ahead and subscribe to the series, like the video. It does help out, make sure that it gets to the right people and that the reach is further. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.